A wounded stranger stumbled into Clara's yard, bleeding and half dead, clutching a secret worth more than any gold rush claim. With her children starving and no future in sight, she should have turned him away. But instead she saved him. What he left behind wasn't just gold buried in a cave. It was a legacy that would echo for centuries, transforming a dying homestead into a living testament of love, mercy, and staying when it was easier to run. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of becoming rich in everything that truly matters. The first time Clara Bell saw the man, he was stumbling over the ridge with blood on his coat and a rifle dragging behind him. She thought he might be a mirage. It had been 3 days since she'd slept more than an hour at a time, 5 since her youngest had taken solid food, and longer still since anything in her life had looked like a future. She watched him from the doorway of her sod house, the handle of a kettle wrapped in her calloused palm, the wind tugging her dress sideways as dust peeled up in soft eddies from the barren land. He stumbled again, then collapsed just beyond the frost-bitten fence that kept nothing out but the idea of privacy. "Mama," came a voice behind her, thin, barely above a whisper. "There's a man?" Clara turned slowly. Lottie stood in the doorway with sunken cheeks and eyes too big for her face. The child's fever had broken the night before, but only just. Clara had used the last of their willow bark tea. What little broth she could spare was still warming on the stove. "I see him," she said. "He's got blood," Lottie murmured. "Yes." "Is he dead?" Clara hesitated. Not yet. She stepped off the threshold and into the cold. The wind clawed through her braid, whipped dust across her boots, and stung her cheeks like insult. She moved quickly, ignoring the stiffness in her knees, the hollow ache in her belly, the warning voice in the back of her mind that whispered about dangers and men and things best left alone. She reached him just as he tried to roll over. "Don't," she said sharply. "You'll tear yourself worse." His eyes fluttered, pale, gray-blue, rimmed in red. "Ma'am," he breathed. She dropped to her knees and peeled back his coat. The blood was everywhere, seeping from a wound just above his left hip, dark and thick and spreading fast. She could already see where he'd tried to bind it with a shirt sleeve. It hadn't held. "I'm going to get you inside," she said. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't trust—" "I don't," she said flatly. "Not you, not anyone. But you're bleeding on my land, and my daughter's watching from the window, so you're not dying out here." It took all the strength she had left to haul him up beneath the arms and drag him toward the house. His boots left wide trails in the dust, and her back screamed with every step. Lottie held the door open, her thin arms shaking, and Clara maneuvered the man through the narrow entry and onto the old cot by the stove. She cut away his shirt with sewing shears and found the wound. It was a gunshot. Clean through, but angry and raw. She didn't ask who'd fired it. She didn't care. She boiled water and used the last of her soap. She poured whiskey from a jar Frank had left behind, the one she'd sworn never to touch. She cleaned the wound with trembling fingers while the man bit down on a scrap of cloth and arched in pain. Lottie turned her face away. Her little brother Ellis, too weak to cry, whimpered from the bed in the corner. "Hold on," Clara muttered to the man. "If you're going to die, you'll do it clean." He didn't die. That night he burned with fever, but he breathed. By morning, he was still breathing. And by the time Ellis took his first real swallow of broth in nearly a week, Clara began to think maybe, just maybe, he'd live long enough to explain himself. She didn't expect thanks. She didn't expect anything. But she got it anyway. On the third day, when the man's eyes cleared and his voice returned, he said her name before she'd offered it. "Clara Bell," he rasped. She froze where she stood, holding a cracked bowl in her hands. "How do you know my name?" He tried to smile, but it came out more like a wince. "You delivered my sister's baby in Fort Keogh 2 years back." Clara blinked. Her name was Abby Reed. Clara remembered. A girl with too much fear in her eyes and too much blood on her skirt. A birth that nearly ended 2 lives, a quiet night, a safe delivery, and a thank you scribbled in pencil on a piece of butcher paper. "You're her brother?" He nodded. "Name's Silas," he said. "Silas Reed." She looked at him, really looked, and saw it then. The jawline, the eyes, the shape of the mouth. It was there, buried beneath the dirt and the blood and the weight of whatever had chased him across the prairie. "She wrote me a letter," Clara said quietly. "Told me the baby's name was Hope." Silas's eyes closed for a moment. "She's the reason I left," he murmured. "Didn't want that baby to grow up with a target on her back." Clara didn't ask what he meant. Not yet. There was time, and not much else. For the next week she fed him what she could spare. Broth, boiled potatoes, half a biscuit, when Ellis didn't finish his supper. She changed his bandages with clean linen stripped from the curtain. She let Lottie sit beside him with her worn storybook and read aloud in a voice that had once been bright and was now just soft and thin. Silas listened, always. He didn't ask for anything, but he watched everything. He saw the way Clara rubbed her hands each morning, stiff from cold. The way she counted the eggs with her fingers, tapping each one like a prayer. The way she wrapped Ellis in her own shawl at night and sat beside him while the wind howled against the walls. "You lost your husband?" he asked one evening as she stirred a pot of thin stew. "3 winters ago," she said. "Fever took him before the spring thaw." Silas was quiet. "And you?" She turned, catching him staring into the fire. "What happened to you?" He looked at her then, his gray-blue eyes like smoke. "I struck gold." Clara snorted. So did every man with dirt under his nails in Montana territory. "I struck gold," he said again, slowly. "Real gold, big vein, near Red Knife Ridge." She stared. "They tried to kill me for it, my partners, men I'd known for years." "Why'd they fail?" "Because I got lucky," he said. "And because I ran." Clara was quiet a long time. Then she said, "And you brought your bad luck to my door." Silas shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said. "I brought a promise." She narrowed her eyes. "What promise?" He looked at the children, at Lottie's bare feet, at Ellis's cough, at the patched blankets and the way Clara held herself like something always waiting to break. "I made a map," he said, "before they shot me. Buried it." "Why?" "In case I didn't make it. In case someone better than me did." He looked up at her. "And now I did. And you saved me." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Slow, uncertain. "You offering me gold? I'm offering your children something more." "Which is?" "A future." She didn't believe him, not at first. But the next day he asked for a shovel and a saddle. "You're not ready to ride," she told him. "I'll ride slow." She let him go. They returned at dusk, and in his hands, wrapped in oilskin and trembling, was a canvas roll, stained with blood and marked with coordinates. "This, Asuati Burinadas," he said, "will change everything." And it did. Clara didn't sleep that night. The map lay folded on the table beneath a chipped saucer, as if the weight of the dish might keep it from blowing away in a gust of wind or dream. She stared at it long after the fire burned down, listening to the rhythmic wheeze of Ellis's breath and the gentle rustle of Lottie's restless feet in her sleep. Silas had gone quiet after handing it to her. He hadn't asked for food, hadn't spoken much at all, only sat on the edge of the cot and watched the fire as if the flames might spell out a future he couldn't yet see. "What do I do with this?" she asked finally, her voice low in the dark. Silas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was hoarse. "You do whatever you want. I want to survive the week." He looked up. "That map can make you more than a survivor." She shook her head. "You talk like gold solves things." "It does," he said, "for people like me. And it ruins people like me, too." Clara folded her arms, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "I'm not after riches." "No," he said softly. "You're after tomorrow." That silenced her. In the morning she unfolded the map again. It was hand-drawn, the kind of thing made in a hurry, ink smudged, compass lines uneven. But the location was clear. There, on the northern edge of a place called Red Knife Ridge, was a small X surrounded by scratchy notes, quartz vein, rich dirt, hidden split in cliff face. The coordinates were penciled in a careful hand. She didn't know how to read half of them. "Can you take me there?" she asked over coffee made from reused grounds. Silas nodded. "But I won't dig it out." "Why?" "Because it's not mine anymore." She stared at him across the table. "You're just giving it to me?" He met her eyes. "You already gave me more than I ever had." Clara's throat tightened, but she swallowed it down. That afternoon she packed the children into the wagon and left them with Mrs. Arlo, a neighbor 10 miles east, who had a soft heart and too many chickens. Then she and Silas saddled 2 horses, her old mare and the Mustang he'd borrowed from her lean-to, and rode west. The trail was rough, the wind sharper the farther they went, and Clara found herself watching Silas more than the path, looking for signs of pain, of faltering, of lies. But he rode like a man with nothing to lose and just enough reason to hold steady. When he slowed, she slowed. When he winced, she didn't ask. They reached Red Knife Ridge after nightfall and camped in silence near the base. In the moonlight, the ridge was jagged and high, a dark-toothed beast rising from the prairie. Clara sat by the fire, the map in her lap, the wind tugging at her sleeves. "You could have buried the gold," she said. "Lived rich and quiet. Why come here, bleeding and half dead?" Silas poked the fire with a stick. "Because dying rich ain't the same as dying good." In the morning they climbed. The split in the cliff face was narrow, hard to find. But Silas knew it well. They crawled through thorny brush and up loose stone, and at the end of a narrow ledge they found a small cave. Inside the air was cool and still, and in the center, half buried under flat rocks and a sheet of canvas, lay a crate sealed with pitch and dust. Clara's breath caught as Silas knelt and pulled the canvas away. Gold. Not glittering nuggets like in fairy tales, but chunks. Raw, heavy, dull bright, with weight and promise. He looked up at her. "It's all here." She stared, unable to speak. "This is what they tried to kill me for," he said. "But I'd rather see it feed your kids than buy me another lie." Clara dropped to her knees beside the crate. "How much?" "Enough." "Enough for what?" Silas leaned back on his heels. "Enough for Ellis to see a doctor, for Lottie to go to school, for you to never boil water over cow chips again." She swallowed. "You don't owe me this." He tilted his head. "You fed me, stitched me up, gave me fire and breath and a second shot at meaning something. I was being decent. You were being better than this world deserves." They carried what they could down the ridge, gold, stuffed in saddlebags, wrapped in linen, hidden beneath dried oats. It was a slow descent, each step echoing with something neither of them could name. Clara didn't speak until the horses were mounted again. "I don't know what to do with it." Silas reached across and squeezed her hand. "You will." When they returned to the homestead 3 days later, the wind had shifted. Spring had begun to whisper through the dirt. Clara gathered the children, kissed them hard, and held them longer than she should have. Then she opened the trapdoor beneath the sod house floor and buried the gold deep. She sold a small piece first, a sliver to a trader who didn't ask questions, then another. She fixed the roof, bought medicine, got proper shoes for Lottie, and sent Ellis south to see a doctor with a real degree. She never said where the money came from. No one asked, but people noticed. Her eyes were brighter, her shoulders straighter. And every night Silas still sat at the fire, not a guest, not a patient, just a man who'd stayed. One day Lottie asked him, "Are you our PA now?" Silas looked at Clara, then at the child. "I hope so," he said. Lottie nodded. "Okay." They were married in the orchard 3 years later, under the only tree that bloomed without asking. The gold stayed hidden, but its fruits grew tall and strong and loud with laughter, and the children, now grown, never forgot the day a bleeding man arrived on their porch with nothing but a wound and a promise, and gave them everything. The years that followed moved like seasons through the prairie, slow, then swift, then somehow gone. Clara built a life with Silas the same way she had built her sod house, with grit, with bare hands, with silence where there used to be pain. The gold never made them rich in the way people thought of riches. There were no parlor rooms with velvet curtains, no carriages, no crystal chandeliers. But there was warmth, there was food, there was safety. And safety, Clara came to learn, was the most valuable thing a person could own. The hidden cash beneath the trapdoor remained untouched for long stretches. She took from it only what was needed, when the roof needed mending, when the field needed seed, when a neighbor fell ill and the doctor in Miles City needed a down payment before his wheels would turn. Each time she peeled back the oilskin wrappings, she did so with a breath held between her ribs, as if the gold might vanish under her fingertips. It never did. Silas never asked how much was left. He only said, "Enough?" And she would answer, "Still." He worked harder than any man she'd known. The limp from the bullet wound never fully left him, but he never used it as an excuse. He helped Clara turn the lean-to into a second barn, built a well house with his own 2 hands, taught Ellis how to trim hooves, and Lottie how to shoe a mare without flinching. When it rained, he read aloud from his journal. When it snowed, he carved toys from scrap wood and fixed whatever hinge or latch had gone loose in the wind. He never spoke of the men who shot him, not until years had passed. One autumn, when the corn had gone dry and the wind carried dust in its teeth, Clara found him sitting on the porch, staring off toward the west ridge with a long stare. "They're gone," he said. She sat beside him without asking. "The ones who tried to kill me. Last one was found dead in a river south of Lewistown." Clara said nothing. "I thought I'd feel relief." "And? I don't?" She rested her head on his shoulder. "You lived a different story." He nodded. That winter, Ellis turned 13 and asked for his own plot of land to till come spring. Clara handed him a survey map and pointed out the spot behind the old cottonwoods. He started clearing it the next day. Lottie was reading by then, devouring books by lamplight, curled up on the rug with a fire roaring behind her. She wrote poems when she thought no one was looking, left them in drawers, pressed between pages, tucked under Silas's plate at breakfast. He never said a word about them, just folded them gently and placed them in his coat pocket like they were the most precious thing he'd ever been given. It was Lottie who found the old map one morning, creased and faded, still wrapped in its stained oilskin, tucked deep behind the shelf of dry goods. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. Clara set down her bread dough and wiped her hands on her apron. That's where our story changed. Lottie opened the map, tracing her fingers over the faded X. "Did you ever go back?" "No," Clara said. "We took what we needed, left the rest." Lottie tilted her head. "Aren't you afraid someone will find it?" Clara smiled. "No, because it's not the gold that mattered." "What was it then?" Clara walked to the window and looked out across the prairie, where the wind bent the grass and the horses stood calm and content under the pale winter sky. It was the man who gave it away. As the years passed, word of the McCall place spread. Folks came by to trade, to ask for help, to borrow tools or advice or warmth. Clara gave freely. So did Silas. They never said where the money came from. No one asked. Or if they did, it was only in the quietest of ways. "I hear you made a lucky claim," one man said. Clara looked him in the eye and said, "We made a good decision." And that was that. In time, Ellis took over the southern field, built a small cabin for himself, took a wife with a laugh like thunder and a stubborn streak to match his mother's. They had 2 boys before the first gray showed in his beard. Lottie left for school in Denver, but she came home every summer. And one day she brought a girl with her, a bright-eyed woman with ink stains on her fingertips and a mind full of questions. Clara took one look at them and set an extra place at the table. "You staying long?" she asked the girl. "As long as she'll have me," came the answer. Clara smiled. "Then welcome home." Silas slowed with age. His hands stiffened, his limp grew worse, but his eyes stayed sharp, and his voice never lost its warmth. He took to writing more, his journal growing thick with observations, with small stories, with details of a life he'd never expected to live. "I should have died on that ridge," he told Clara one night. "You saved me." Clara placed a hand over his. "You were worth saving." They buried him beneath the cottonwoods on a morning when the sky was clear and the wind was still. No headstone, just a carved plank of wood that read, "Silas Reed." He gave it all away. Ellis spoke at the service. Lottie read one of her poems. Clara stood silent until the very end, then laid the old map on top of the grave, folded and tied with a ribbon from their wedding day. She never touched the gold again. Didn't need to. They had enough. Enough to plant and harvest. Enough to give and grow. Enough to raise a family that didn't measure worth in coin, but in kindness, and in the way you looked a person in the eye and told them they belonged. Lottie kept writing. Published a book of poems called The X on the Ridge. It sold modestly. She didn't care. Ellis taught his sons how to repair a wheel, how to smell a storm before it hit, how to carry their grandfather's name with pride. And Clara, in her final years, sat in a rocking chair on the porch, watching the prairie stretch wide and forgiving before her. Sometimes she talked to Silas, sometimes she read aloud from his journal, and sometimes she just closed her eyes and let the wind carry the weight of all they had built. She died in her sleep on the first warm night of spring, with the sound of her granddaughter laughing in the next room and the scent of rising bread drifting from the stove. They buried her beside Silas, beneath the same tree. Lottie placed the final journal between them. On the last page, written in Clara's hand, were the words, "We were poor in everything but love, until he came. And then we were rich in ways this world may never understand. We shared the gold, we shared the work, we shared the story. And in the end, we stayed." That was the real fortune, and it never ran out. By the time Lottie was the age her mother had been, when Silas first rode bleeding into their lives, the ranch had grown into something unrecognizable to outsiders. Bigger, certainly, with more land fenced and more hands working it. But to Lottie, it still smelled like firewood and bread, like horse sweat and wild prairie sage. The same wind blew across the fields. The same barn doors creaked. The same tree shaded the graves of those who had loved her most. She took over the journals then. It wasn't a ceremony. No one passed her a torch. No one announced it. But when the newest hand, a boy barely 20, with sharp eyes and a knot of grief tied hard around his ribs, asked, "Who keeps the records around here?" every eye turned to her. So she began. Every evening, after the dishes were scrubbed and the porch swept and the chickens penned, she sat at the same table her mother once had and opened a fresh page. She wrote in blue ink, neat, clean, truthful. She wrote about the weather and the cattle, about the way her niece sang off-key while mucking stalls, about the sour cherry pie her sister-in-law tried to make that ended in laughter and blackened crusts. But she also wrote about the deeper things, the way silence clung to the house on the anniversary of Clara's passing, the way the younger children asked questions about Silas that made her cry when she tried to answer, the way sometimes she stood alone on the ridge above the house and felt the breath of history in her chest so heavy it almost knocked her over. People came and went, always had, always would. Some stayed for a harvest, others stayed for a lifetime. They arrived with calloused hands, broken boots, letters from relatives who'd once worked the land. They brought sorrow and hope and hard-earned humility, and always they asked the same thing: "Is there room?" There always was, because Clara and Silas had built something bigger than fences and fields. They'd built a refuge, and that kind of foundation didn't crack, not in drought, not in flood, not even when time marched on and names faded from stone. One winter a journalist from Helena rode in, his notebook full of curiosity and a stubborn doubt in his voice. He wanted to know about the gold, the hidden fortune whispered about in saloons and train stations and backroom card games. Lottie met him at the gate, arms folded across her coat. He asked his questions. She answered the ones worth answering. "Is it true?" he asked. "Your grandfather left a claim untouched?" "It's true he left something behind." "What was it?" She turned her gaze toward the cottonwood. "You'll have to stay a while to understand." He didn't stay. But he wrote a story anyway, called it The Prairie Widow's Treasure. Said it was about hidden riches and the kind of love that could change a bloodied prospector into a legend. Lottie read it once, then folded the paper and put it in the drawer where they kept scraps for the stove. Because it wasn't about gold. Not really. It never had been. The real fortune was in the way her mother never hesitated to save a stranger, in the way Silas had handed over his life's greatest discovery without a moment's hesitation, in the way they'd built something lasting not with money, but with memory. One day Lottie stood in the orchard with her niece, hand in hand, the apple blossoms drifting down around them like snow. "Do you think they're proud?" the little girl asked. Lottie looked down. "Who?" "Grandma Clara? Grandpa Silas?" Lottie smiled, tears hot behind her eyes. "I think they've never stopped watching." She didn't have children of her own. Life hadn't gone that way. But she didn't feel childless. Not here. Not with a dozen young voices echoing through the fields, each of them fed by the soil her family had kept alive, each of them sleeping under a roof built from sacrifice, each of them reading from the journals by lamplight when the power went out and the wind rattled the windows. One spring she pulled up the trapdoor beneath the old sod house. It creaked the same as it had 60 years ago. The gold was still there, less than it had once been, but still plenty, untouched for decades, covered in linen and wrapped in wax paper. She didn't take it. She only closed the door, replaced the board, and swept the dust smooth with the same care her mother had shown in everything she did. Because they didn't need it now. They had the land, the orchard, the name, the story. And as long as someone stayed to keep telling it, the fortune would never run out, not in their lifetime, not ever. When Lottie passed, the wind was blowing softly through the orchard, and the early morning light cast long gold lines across the fields. She died in the same bed her mother had once laid in, beneath the same stitched quilt, with the window cracked open just enough for the air to carry the scent of lilacs and turned soil. The family gathered quietly. No one rushed. No one cried too loud. Her breath had grown shallow over the last few days, but her eyes had remained clear and her hands steady right to the end. She'd known it was coming. She'd written her last journal entry the night before. The trees are blooming again, the orchard hums. I saw Elsie reading by lantern light and heard Jacob hammering up fence line like he was in a race with the wind. The dogs are sleeping beside the stove, and the gate is still open. It's all still here. I've left nothing unfinished. That page was left open on the desk when her niece found her the next morning, curled into the pillows with a peaceful smile on her lips. There was no grand funeral. That wasn't Lottie's way. They buried her beside Clara and Silas, beneath the same cottonwood tree, and instead of eulogies, they read from the blue journal she had filled with a life's worth of observation and love. The children placed dogwood blossoms on her grave. The oldest of them, Jacob, read aloud the first page she'd ever written after taking over the journals. "If legacy is a thing that walks beside us, then let this land be my companion. Let it outlive me, not because I built it, but because I listened to it, because I wrote it down, because I stayed. After that, the journals passed to Elsie. She'd been preparing for it, even if she didn't realize. She had her aunt's quiet way, her mother's strong voice, and the same hunger to capture the truth of small moments. She took to the desk without being asked, sorting the journals into seasons, tying ribbons around them, labeling the spines in careful block print. The first thing she wrote as custodian of the story was short. They're all still here. I see them in the orchard. I hear them in the gate swinging open. I smell them in the dust. I carry them in the silence between chores. I don't have to ask if they're proud. I can feel it. The ranch changed again, as it always did. Technology came in small bursts, solar panels on the barn, a radio tower set behind the far ridge, a windmill that powered the new well pump. But the heart of it never shifted. They still baked bread every Sunday, still sat around the fire with the dogs asleep at their feet, still passed tools from hand to hand, and learned each job through patient repetition. One summer, a young woman arrived from Chicago with a camera and a quiet voice. She'd read about the ranch in a footnote buried deep in a university archive, some mention of a gold claim, of a widow, of a prospector who left it all behind for something better. I thought it was a legend, she said. Elsie shook her head. It was a beginning. The woman stayed a week, took photos of the journals, the barn, the graves beneath the cottonwood. She asked if she could publish the story. It's not mine to sell, Elsie said, but it's ours to share. The article appeared the next spring in a national magazine. It was titled, "The Prairie Fortune That Was Never Spent." It told of Clara Bell, a widow with nothing but a sod house and 2 sick children, who saved a bleeding man and built a legacy with open hands. People came after that. More than before. Not in caravans, but in pairs. A couple grieving a lost child. A teacher trying to write her first book. A soldier between deployments. Each of them asked the same question, "Can I stay for a while?" And each time, Elsie answered, "Of course." The journals kept filling. They lined the shelves of the old parlor and, spread into the reading room, added in Lottie's time. Each volume held different handwriting, different voices, but the story remained the same. One page from a boy named Caleb read, "I didn't know what love looked like until I saw a man fix a broken gate without being asked." Another from a woman named Naomi, "I was raised to expect nothing. This land gave me everything, sunlight, silence, the courage to start again." Even the animals were folded into the narrative. Elsie's nephew wrote a full page about a mule named Harriet, who refused to be saddled unless you sang to her first. Another described the way the chickens only laid in the northeast corner coop and only when the lantern was lit before dawn. There were sad pages, too, of deaths, of dry years, of failed harvests and burnt bread, and days where the wind was too loud and the loneliness too sharp. But always those pages ended the same way. Still we stayed. On the 100th anniversary of the ranch's founding, the county held a small ceremony. The governor sent a letter. A local theater troupe staged a dramatic reading from the earliest journals. A child stood and read Josie's words from the first generation. "We were poor in everything but love, until he came. And then we were rich in ways this world may never understand." And no one needed to say anything more. Elsie died in her 80s, just like her aunt, with a pen in her hand and her final entry half finished. Her niece, Nora, found her there at the desk, the window open, the journal lit by soft morning sun. The last words she'd written were, "Another spring. The blossoms are heavy. The calves are loud. The wind is kind today. I think I've done what I came to do." Nora took up the pen next. She wrote beneath it, "You did, and now it's our turn." And the story continued, because someone had stayed, because someone always would. And as long as the wind moved through the orchard and the gate swung freely on its hinges, that story, the true fortune, would never end. Another spring arrived with the same quiet fanfare it always had. Soft winds, the first licks of green along the hills, birds nesting in the rafters of the barn. The orchard bloomed so thick with blossoms it looked like the trees had caught fire in white and pink. The calves bawled in the southern pasture, and a new foal with long legs and a crooked blaze took its first wobbly steps under the careful eye of its mother. Nora took to the journal each night like it was a prayer. She'd never meant to be the one to carry the story forward. She was quieter than the others, more prone to wandering than staying. But after Elsie passed, after she found that last page unfinished, something in her rooted so deep she felt the shift in her bones. She moved into the old sod house, not the main house, where her cousins and siblings raised their own broods, but the one that had once sheltered Clara and her babies. And then the wounded man who became the cornerstone of their lives. It had been rebuilt over the decades, reinforced with timber and stone, a new roof, a fresh stove. But it was still small, still sacred. She scrubbed it clean, polished the windows, and placed fresh linens on the bed. Then she took the old map, creased and fragile, its ink faded but still legible, and framed it above the mantel. "I won't spend it," she told her reflection one evening, "but I won't forget it either." People still came, not because of the magazine article, not anymore, but because word spread the way prairie fire does, fast and hot and true. They came with their pain tucked behind their ribs, with bruised hearts and hands that didn't know where to rest. Some came to work. Others just needed somewhere they weren't questioned. Nora gave them both. There was a girl named Ivy who didn't speak for the first 2 weeks, only helped muck stalls and feed chickens. One morning, she sat beside Nora at breakfast and whispered, "My father tried to make me marry someone." Nora passed her a jar of jam. "We don't make people do things here." And Ivy stayed. There was a boy from the Dakotas who'd lost everything in a fire. He showed up barefoot, all ribs and wide eyes, and said only, "I heard you got room." They did. Nora handed him a hammer. He built a new chicken coop. One night, sitting by the fire with a dozen people around her, some family, some strangers who weren't strangers anymore, Nora opened a new journal and wrote, "This place doesn't run on gold. It runs on memory, on mercy, on meals passed hand to hand, and names spoken gently, and stories told beneath cottonwood trees. We are richer than anyone who's ever held a vein of earth in their palms." Because we hold something they never did, each other. That year, they celebrated the first wedding in the orchard since Silas and Clara. Ivy, in a dress she made herself, and the boy from Dakota, now grown strong, his hands calloused with work and trust. They said their vows under the cottonwood while the youngest children tossed flower petals, and Nora read from Josie's journal. She ended with the line that had begun it all: "If you stay long enough, love will find a way to root." The seasons rolled on. The ranch grew and shrank in small ways. One barn added, one windmill removed, 3 more graves under the tree, and 2 babies born under summer stars. They buried Boone II, a great old dog who had watched over the porch for 15 years beside the first Boone's tree. A boy carved a wooden bone and placed it in the earth. No one told him not to. Each winter, before the first snow, Nora pulled the journals down from the shelves and read a few pages aloud in the parlor, sometimes to guests, sometimes just to herself. She didn't always choose the dramatic entries. Sometimes she picked small ones, like Silas writing about learning how to bake a potato properly, or Clara describing the way Lottie's laugh had changed after she'd recovered from fever, or Elsie recording the first sunrise after her aunt passed, noting only it was orange, like fire, like beginning again. One winter, Nora caught a fever that wouldn't break. The doctor from town came and stayed 3 days. She pulled through, but just barely. When she was strong enough to write again, she did. I thought about what I'd leave behind if this was it. The ink, the shelves, the names. But what I really hope stays isn't my handwriting. It's the feeling people get when they walk through our gate. I want that to last longer than any page." She gave the next journal to Ivy. "You've got the heart for it," she said. Ivy shook her head. "I can't write like you." "You're not supposed to," Nora said. "You're supposed to write like you." And she did. The ranch kept going. Fires were built. Babies were born. Fences mended. Chickens escaped and were caught. Apples were harvested. Bread was baked. People fell in love. People died. People stayed. Always they stayed, and on the 150th year of the ranch's birth, Ivy's daughter read aloud from the newest journal beneath the cottonwood tree, her voice clear, her hands steady. We still carry their names, not because we must, but because we want to, because their choices gave us choices, because their story gave us the courage to write our own, and because every time the wind moves through this orchard, we remember the woman who opened her door, and the man who gave it all away. This is our inheritance, and it will never run out. They didn't clap. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. The wind moved gently through the branches above, and far off in the fading light, someone closed a gate with careful hands, and the story began again. Years later, long after Ivy had filled 5 journals with stories of births, good rains, stubborn calves, and quiet forgiveness, a girl named Alma found the map again. She was 12, with dirt under her fingernails and questions stacked higher than the hay bales she helped throw in the loft. She'd been born on the ranch, like her mother and grandmother before her, and had grown up hearing the stories told in rhythm with chores, of Clara and the sod house, of Silas with blood on his shirt and gold in his pocket, of the orchard that bloomed even when everything else was dying. But she wanted proof. And one rainy morning, while sorting through the old desk in the parlor for candles, she found it, creased and soft as cloth, the oilskin fraying at the edges, the lines on it faded but still visible. She ran outside with it clenched in her hands, hollering for her grandmother, who was bent over the garden pulling weeds with a scowl. "I found it," she yelled, "the treasure map." Ivy wiped her hands and looked up with a smile so wide it cracked through the lines of age around her mouth. "You've found what every child on this ranch finds, one way or another," she said, standing. "But it's real," Alma insisted. "The gold is real, isn't it?" Ivy took the map from her, smoothing it over her palm like it was a relic. "Yes, baby," she said. "It's real." "Then why didn't anybody take it all?" Ivy looked down the ridge toward the edge of the orchard, where the cottonwood still stood tall against the sky. "Because we already had what we needed," she said. "But what if we need it now?" Ivy turned to look at her granddaughter, so earnest, so alive. "Then we go," she said, "but not to take, just to remember." That weekend, Ivy, Alma, and 3 more of the children rode out past the north ridge with the map in hand. The path wasn't as rough as it had once been. The grass had grown back over the trail, but the stones still pointed the way, and the split in the cliff was still there, narrow and hidden, but real. Inside the cave, the air was cool and damp. The crate had long since been moved. Just a shallow impression in the dirt remained, and the canvas tarp left in one corner. Ivy reached down and ran her hand over the earth like she was greeting an old friend. "There was a time," she said softly, "when the people who lived here had nothing but this claim and each other, and they gave it away, piece by piece, to build everything we have." The children were quiet. Alma reached down and picked up the canvas. "Can I keep this?" "Of course." That night, back at the ranch, she stretched it flat, cut a square, and stitched it into the binding of the newest journal. On the first page she wrote, "I saw the place where it all started, and I stood inside it. And I wasn't afraid, because now I know the treasure was never the gold. It was the choice to give it away, to build a home instead of a hiding place, to give instead of hoard, to stay." Generations passed. The map stayed pinned to the parlor wall. The journals filled and were bound and shelved. And the orchard bloomed again and again and again. Visitors came and asked about the legend. Sometimes they were given the truth. Sometimes they were handed a slice of bread and told to sit and listen, because this wasn't a story to be read in one sitting. It was one to be lived, passed from hand to hand, written in calloused script and soft lamplight, told beside fields plowed straight and children tucked into quilts sewn from pieces of the past. The ranch didn't forget, because they never let it. And somewhere always a child stood with a pen in hand, writing another line. We are still here. We are still staying. We are still rich in everything that matters. In the late summer of the ranch's 200th year, the cottonwood tree bore blossoms out of season. It had bloomed early that year, full and white in spring, as it always did. But now, on the tail end of August, when the ground was cracked with heat and the fields burned gold under the weight of harvest, it bloomed again, just a few, soft and unannounced, a whisper of petals where there should have been only leaves and dust. Alma noticed first. She stood beneath it after morning chores, sweat clinging to her collar, boots scuffed from chasing down a fence breaker, and stared up at the pale new blooms with a stunned kind of reverence. She ran back to the house and returned with the journal, the one she'd inherited after Ivy passed peacefully in her sleep beneath a full moon 3 years prior. She sat beneath the tree, back against its wide, scarred trunk, and wrote, I think the tree is remembering something, or someone. I think it's blooming now not because it's confused, but because it wants to remind us that time isn't as straight as we believe, that maybe grief blooms too. Quietly, beautifully, long after we thought we were done. She left the page open when she went inside, and that night her younger brother Luke, 14 and always curious, read it by lantern light. He didn't say anything, but he tucked a fallen blossom into the journal, pressing it between the pages. The imprint stayed there for years. That fall, Alma invited a historian from Helena to visit the ranch. The woman had written a thesis on prairie settlements, but had never stepped foot on a homestead that had been continuously inhabited by one family for 2 full centuries. She arrived with 3 pencils, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, and more questions than anyone had ever asked at one time. Alma led her into the reading room where the journals filled the walls. I don't know how to begin, the woman whispered. You don't, Alma replied. You listen. The historian stayed a week. She read entries aloud in the evenings, with tears in her eyes, more than once. She followed Luke as he delivered feed to the back pasture and watched him tie his boots with the same loop-over-loop method Silas had once taught Clara's boy Ellis. She helped bake bread. She sat beside Alma beneath the cottonwood and asked finally, What happened to the gold? Alma smiled. It's still here. In the ground? She shook her head. In the orchard, in the stories, in every meal served to a stranger who came looking for a reason to keep going. The woman left with her notes full, and her voice softened. She published an article in a major national magazine titled Where the Fortune Never Ended. She quoted the journals, the family, the land. She called it a living archive. Alma called it home. As the ranch entered its 3rd century, the family held a gathering. Not a reunion. There had been too many over the years for that word to mean anything. It was more of a remembering. Over 200 people came from across the country. Some were blood relatives. Many were not. They slept in tents, in guest cabins, in wagons. Children played between the rows of apple trees. Elders sat on the porch swapping stories, some of which were true, all of which mattered. They read aloud from the earliest journals. A woman named Nora, named for the one who had inherited the books from Elsie, stood beneath the cottonwood and recited the line that had become the ranch's quiet creed. If you stay long enough, love will find a way to root. No one needed to explain what it meant. They all knew. That night, Alma took a walk alone down to the edge of the old split in the ridge. She hadn't been there in years. The trail was overgrown but familiar. The air was warm and still. The stars were just beginning to prick the sky. The cave was still there, empty, silent. She sat at its mouth and pulled from her coat a small tin inside, a gold coin rubbed nearly smooth. One of the last unspent pieces of the original find, not because it had been hoarded, but because it had been held, treasured, a symbol more than a currency. She placed it in the earth, pressed it deep into the ground with both hands, covered it with dust. Then she whispered, "Thank you," and walked back home. That winter the cottonwood didn't bloom early, but the wind, through its branches, hummed like memory. Alma passed 10 years later, in her sleep, under a quilt her grandmother had stitched. Her niece, another Lottie, found the last journal entry in her grandmother's even handwriting. The gate is still open. The wind is still soft. The journals are safe. The gold is still here, not in a box or a cave, but in the way a stranger is handed bread without question, in the way a child asks where they come from and finds an answer that stretches back 200 years. This is what we built. This is what lasts. And below it, a note. If you are the one reading this, it's your turn now. Don't be afraid. Just tell the truth. And stay. Lottie did, and so did the next, and the next. And as long as someone held the journal and watched the orchard bloom, the story would go on, because that was the true inheritance. A life that fed others, a name that meant sanctuary, a map that pointed not to gold, but to grace. And it never ran out. In the spring after Alma's passing, the orchard bloomed early again, not just one tree this time, but all of them, as if something deep in their roots remembered the story that had lived and died and lived again beneath their branches. The air smelled of earth and blossom, and the bees returned in thick, humming clouds that wrapped the fields in motion and purpose. Lottie stood beneath the cottonwood that morning, the newest journal in her hand, still blank. The wind stirred the loose strands of her hair and brought with it the scent of bread baking from the kitchen. The ranch had not slowed with Alma's death. It had shifted, like it always did, folded grief into its routine, made space. The children still needed boots repaired and ponies saddled. Guests still arrived at the gate, unsure whether they were allowed to knock. They were. They always were. Lottie walked the path her grandmother had walked, down to the barn, past the original sod house, now preserved like a museum, into the chicken yard, where the hens scattered around her boots. She remembered when she was 7, standing in this same spot holding Alma's hand, asking if the gold was real. Alma had crouched beside her and whispered, "It is, but we don't use it to buy things. We use it to remind us what matters." And back then Lottie hadn't understood. She did now. She opened the journal at the kitchen table, where flour dusted the surface and sunlight filtered through the muslin curtains, and began to write. "I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of a woman who gave broth to a dying man, with blood on his coat and sorrow in his eyes. He gave her gold. She gave him a home. He gave us everything. And none of it began with wealth. It began with kindness, with the decision to stay. I hold that now. I carry it forward. I will not forget." The year passed slowly and sweetly. A boy named Gideon arrived with no shoes and a suitcase full of books. Lottie gave him a room. He helped repair the water pump and read to the younger children each night on the porch. He stayed. A woman named Helen came looking for her mother and ended up finding a part of herself she thought she'd buried years ago. She planted the summer squash. She stayed too. The journals recorded it all, not with pomp, not with titles or declarations, just with honesty. Gideon fixed the west gate. Helen taught the children a song in a language we didn't know. The orchard is heavy this year. We lost a calf, but saved the next. Ivy's stories are still being passed along. The cottonwood creaked in the wind like it was trying to speak. One night in autumn, after the harvest was brought in and the frost had kissed the first leaves gold, Lottie walked the orchard alone. The moon was high. She passed each tree slowly, naming them the way her mother had, the way Alma had before her. Not with Latin, not with scientific precision, but with names of those who had loved them. That one was Josie. That one was Silas. The twisted one near the fence, Clara. And the sapling that bloomed too early every year, Elsie. She stood beneath it and touched its bark. "This is still yours," she said softly. Later that year, she found something buried deep in one of the trunks, an old carving half hidden by growth, initials, SR plus CB. Her breath caught. She pressed her fingers to the letters. "They never left," she whispered. And in that moment, she knew what she would write. She ran back to the house, lit the lamp, and opened the journal. We are not just descendants. We are the continuation. The breath after the promise. The fire after the storm. We do not carry the story in our hands. We are the story. And as long as someone stays, the fortune will not fade. The gold remains, not in crates, but in the way someone looks up when you enter a room and says, "I've saved you a place." The years continued, slowly, steadily. Lottie aged, passed the journal to her nephew. The orchard remained. So did the house. The cottonwood stood tall against every storm. And in every generation, someone asked, why didn't they spend it? And the answer was always the same. They did. And they still are. In the dusk light of early spring, with the air just beginning to soften and the creek whispering back to life beyond the ridge, the children gathered around the newest journal. They sat cross-legged on the floor of the reading room, the kind with sloping floorboards and shelves sagging from the weight of memory, and took turns reading aloud. None of them older than 12, most too young to remember Alma or Ivy firsthand, but they knew the stories. They'd been told and retold under blankets and stars, between wheelbarrow rides and baking lessons, while stringing up lights for barn dances and collecting the first eggs of the season. Their parents had told them. Their grandparents, the hands who stayed for a season and left behind a chapter in the journals. They all spoke the same truths. We stay, we remember, we build something no storm can scatter. One of the older girls, Ruth, read aloud from a journal dated nearly a century earlier. Her voice trembled, but didn't falter. The man who arrived bleeding gave us gold. We gave him a table, a quilt, a name spoken softly across the stove. He left us more than money. He left us a new way to measure what matters. A boy named Elijah closed the book with reverence. "Do you think it's really still there?" he asked. "The gold?" The others looked at him, curious. "I mean," he went on, "they never took all of it, right? Isn't that what they say?" Ruth tilted her head. "Why would we need to find it?" Elijah shrugged. "I don't know. To see it, I guess. Touch it. Would that make it more real?" He didn't answer. A voice came from the hallway behind them, soft, amused. "It's real enough?" They turned. Nora, who was neither young nor old, who worked the orchard like her mother before her, and stitched all the names of the dead into one long cloth that hung above the fireplace, leaned in the doorway. Her sleeves were rolled. Her hands still smelled like cider vinegar and smoke. "I've seen it," she said. The room held still. "I was 17. Alma took me to the cave, just once. She told me to look and decide for myself what it meant." Elijah's eyes widened. "What did it look like?" Nora smiled. "Heavy, not shiny like in books, but real. So real I felt the weight of it in my chest for weeks after." "Did you take any?" She shook her head. "Didn't need to." He frowned. "But we could still use it, couldn't we? I mean, for the roof? For the well pump?" "We already have the roof," Nora said. "We already fixed the pump, and if they break again, we'll fix them again. That's what we do. We don't spend the gold. We live the reason it was given." She stepped into the room and set down a plate of honey bread on the table. "Now eat, then you can help me write tonight's page." The children swarmed the plate, but Ruth lingered. She watched Nora open the newest journal, Flip past the entries from the last few weeks, notes about frost, about mended boots, about a newborn lamb, and then rest her hand on the blank page. "Are you going to write about today?" Ruth asked. "I am." "Even though it wasn't big?" "It was," Nora said. "You read from the book, you asked questions. You reminded me why we write it all down." Ruth stood straighter. "Will you write that I read it well?" "I will." "And that Elijah asked about the gold?" Nora nodded. "And that you answered him better than I ever could." That night's entry was simple. The children read from the old words. They asked about gold. We answered with truth. They understood more than they know. The orchard is budding. The creek is running. The lamps burn late, and no one feels alone. This is what the gold became. This is what stays. The journal filled over the months that followed, page after page of laughter and loss, of hard work and firewood, of new animals and old guests returning after decades away. One entry came from a girl named Mira, who had only meant to stay for a week but ended up planting sunflowers by the fence and sleeping in the loft for the entire summer. She wrote, "I came here lost. You didn't ask what broke me. You handed me pie and boots and a shovel. I don't know how to repay that, so I'll stay until I've helped enough to earn your story." She stayed 5 years. On the anniversary of the ranch's founding, they held the celebration like always, potluck tables stretching down the yard, guitars playing into the night, candles flickering in every window. They read aloud again from the journals, the youngest of the children holding pages in trembling fingers and standing tall. Elijah, now a teenager, read from the original journal entry, the one written by Clara herself. He was bleeding when he came, and I was empty. And somehow, between the two of us, we made something worth keeping. He paused, then looked up. "And we still are," he said. The crowd was quiet for a beat. Then someone clapped. And another, and soon it rolled through the orchard like thunder. That night, under the stars, Elijah sat with Ruth near the cottonwood. The blossoms had just begun to bud again. He held his own notebook in his lap, blank, waiting. "I think I'm going to start writing," he said. Ruth leaned her head on his shoulder. "You already are." And in the darkness, with the sound of laughter in the distance and the scent of warm earth beneath them, Elijah turned to the first page and wrote, "They told us we didn't need to find the gold, but I think we did. We found it in firelight and kindness. In the way the wind carries old names like promises, in the way strangers become family and no one ever has to leave afraid. We found it right here, and we stayed." Years later, when Elijah was a grown man with calloused hands and a quiet voice, he stood at the edge of the cottonwood grove and watched his daughter chase chickens across the yard, her braids flapping like wings, her laughter ringing off the barn walls. It was the kind of day that made the world feel tender, just after rain, the sky wide and clean, the soil beneath his boots soft but certain. The orchard behind him was in bloom again. Always it bloomed, even in the hard years, especially in the hard years. Inside the house, the latest journal sat open on the kitchen table. Its pages were thick with stories, pressed petals, old ribbon clippings, ticket stubs from county fairs, a lock of baby hair tied in string, notes written in the handwriting of nearly a dozen people. It had become the kind of book that sagged with love, and it was nearly full. That morning, before the sun rose, Elijah had sat with his daughter in his lap, her head resting on his shoulder, her breath warm against his collarbone. "She asked about him," he told Ruth later that day. "Silas." "She will again," Ruth said. "They always do." I told her the truth. "What part?" "That he bled on our floor and gave us everything we didn't know how to ask for." "That's enough." She asked if we ever found the gold, and I said we're sitting on it. They both laughed, not because it was a joke, but because it was the answer, and always had been. Later that week, a man arrived at the gate, gray-bearded, lean, riding a tired mule and wearing a coat that had seen 3 lifetimes of weather. He introduced himself simply. "My name's Harris Gentry," he said. "My great-uncle was Silas." Elijah didn't say a word at first, just stepped forward and opened the gate. "You're home," he said. Harris dismounted slowly. "I never knew any of this was still here." Elijah looked out at the orchard, at the house, at the hills beyond. It never left. They fed him stew that night, spiced, hearty, the way Silas used to like it, according to the journals. They poured him coffee, sat him by the fire. And when the evening quieted, Harris opened a small cloth pouch and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed and soft. "I found this in an attic," he said. "It's addressed to Clara." He passed it to Elijah, whose hands were careful and reverent. The handwriting was familiar, even after all this time. He read aloud, "Clara, I don't know what becomes of men like me, men who've seen too much, taken too much, run too long. But if there's a God, and if I'm lucky enough to get a second chance, I hope it looks like your kitchen stove, your daughter's smile, the way you stirred broth like it could cure anything. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I'm gone, I want you to know that the gold wasn't what saved me. You were, you and your babies, and your silence, and your strength. If I left anything behind, let it be this: a life full of peace, a name worth carrying, a story worth telling. Yours in every breath, Silas." No one spoke for a long time after that. Elijah folded the letter and placed it inside the front cover of the newest journal. That week, Ruth's daughter read it aloud to the children during story hour. Not because it was a legend, but because it was part of their bones. One boy whispered, "Did he really mean it?" Another answered, "He must have. Look at us." Time went on as it always does. Harris stayed. He helped mend the fence around the west pasture and rebuilt the bench swing beneath the cottonwood. He took to carving wooden toys for the youngest and never once asked for gold. He said, "I didn't come for what he left. I came for what you kept." And what they kept, what they always kept, wasn't gold or land or names carved into deeds. They kept the promise. The table stayed open. The fire stayed lit. The journals kept filling. And when the day came for Elijah to pass the story to his daughter, he did it the way it had always been done, without ceremony, without performance. He handed her the journal. She opened it to a blank page, and she wrote, "He came with nothing but a wound and a secret. She gave him shelter, and he gave her children something no bullet could steal, a future. We carry that future now, in our hands, in our harvest, in every kindness, passed without question. The gold remains, in us, around us, between us, and it will never run out." And so it continued. The girl with the journal, her name was Lily, grew up with ink under her fingernails and wind in her hair. She could fix a hinge before she could write in cursive, and knew the history of the orchard better than most professors knew their own names. She grew tall and sure, the kind of steady that couldn't be taught in books, only lived. She watched foals take their first breath, watched old hands take their last, and learned how to hold both joy and grief without letting either tip her over. When she turned 16, Elijah took her up to the ridge where the first piece of gold had been hidden all those years ago. They went quietly, just the two of them, at sunrise. The path was overgrown but familiar. The cave was still there, still silent. He didn't bring tools, only a candle and the map. He lit the wick and passed it to her. She held it up, eyes wide in the shadows. "This is where it all began," he said, "and this is where it stayed." Lily knelt and pressed her palm to the ground. "It's still warm," she whispered. He smiled. "It always is." They didn't dig. They didn't need to. Back at the ranch, Lily began writing every day, not just in the journal, but on scraps of paper tucked into saddlebags, on flour-dusted napkins, on the walls of the barn in chalk that would be washed away, but remembered. Her voice found the rhythm of the land, slow and constant. She wrote, "There's a kind of truth here you can only hear in silence. It says, I know you. I've seen you. You're tired, but you're not done. Sit, breathe, stay. Visitors kept coming. A woman with tired eyes and a suitcase full of unopened letters arrived from the city. She stayed in the guest cabin. By the second week, she was feeding chickens. By the third, she was singing again. A young man from the East came to write a book about frontier myths. He stayed for 2 summers, then forgot the book entirely and became a carpenter instead. Children arrived too, some born there, others sent for a season that turned into forever. They learned to speak gently to animals and people, learned to leave room for someone else's story at the table. The journals multiplied. The shelves grew heavy. When they ran out of space, Lily and Ruth built a new wing onto the reading room. Not grand, just wide and long and bright. They called it the Hall of Staying. Each journal had its place, each voice its echo. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of entries, Lily found a folded note at the back of one of the older books, handwriting nearly faded to ghost script. It read, "If you are reading this, then we did our job. We loved. We healed. We planted more than we picked. Let this land wrap around you the way her arms did around me when I thought I was dying. Let this place remind you that kindness never loses its value. Let this family, by blood or by choice, become your next breath. And if you're wondering whether to stay, you already know the answer." It was signed simply, S. She didn't say a word, just refolded the paper, placed it in a glass case on the mantel, and copied the words into the next journal, right at the front. Time kept on. Seasons changed. Children became keepers. Keepers became memory. And still the orchard bloomed. Not every spring, but always when it mattered. One night after supper, Lily sat on the porch with her youngest cousin in her lap. "Why do we write it all down?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened the journal, showed him the pressed flowers, the ink smudges, the line from their grandfather's shaking hand that simply said, "This is what love looks like after it's been tested." Then she said, "Because one day you'll need to remember this, not the gold, not the names, but the way it felt to belong here, and the way we made room for everyone who came to the gate with empty hands and hope still beating in their chest." He thought about that, then whispered, "I'll write too someday." She kissed the top of his head. "You already are." And in the dark, with the porch creaking beneath their feet and the stars blinking above the barn, another story began. The same as the others, and entirely new, because the gold never ran out, because staying was the real treasure, and someone always did. Years later, the youngest boy, who once sat on Lily's lap, his name was Jude, stood in the center of the Hall of Staying, the newest journal open on the lectern, his hands trembling just slightly. He was older now, taller than Lily had ever been, with the same quiet steadiness in his eyes that had once belonged to Clara, to Alma, to Silas. The hall was full, not crowded, but full of breath, of light, of stories waiting to be heard. It was the eve of the ranch's bicentennial, and the family had gathered from across the country, from corners of the world they never expected to reach, drawn not by invitations or obligation, but by gravity, the kind that only grows when hundreds of years of love have packed the earth beneath your feet. Jude cleared his throat. He wore a patched linen shirt and a button that read, "Keeper of the Words." He looked down at the page he'd written just that morning, and then, in a voice that started soft but swelled like the wind through orchard limbs, he read, 200 years ago, a widow with sick children and empty cupboards gave her last bowl of broth to a stranger with a bullet in his side. He offered her gold. She gave him bread. He promised her nothing. She gave him everything. That night, something more valuable than fortune passed between them, the choice to stay. That choice became this ranch, these fields, these stories. That map in the glass case, these names in our mouths. The gold never built the house. The gold never mended the fence. The gold never read stories to a child or rocked someone through grief. It stayed in the ground, mostly untouched. And still, we were rich. He paused, looked up. The fortune, he said, was never what he brought. It was what we built after he decided not to run. Silence filled the room, thick, reverent. Then, one by one, they stood and stepped forward, each person holding a single page they had written. A memory, a moment, a promise. They laid them gently in the new journal, not as chapters to be read now, but as seeds for someone else to find one day. Outside, the orchard was just beginning to bloom. The wind stirred the branches of the cottonwood tree, and a single blossom drifted through the open door of the hall, landed on the floor beside Jude's boot. He picked it up, pressed it between the final 2 pages. Then he wrote, "This is not an ending. This is a thank you. To Clara, who said yes when she had every reason to say no. To Silas, who gave up gold and found peace. To every hand that turned a page, to every mouth that whispered a name, to every soul who walked through our gate and stayed. We are the treasure now, and we will never run out."